This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 576 of the Late Round Podcast. There are many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Hey, football fans, FanDuel and Simple Mobile have partnered up to add an extra layer of excitement to one of the biggest free-to-play contests on the market. Introducing the FanDuel Free-to-Play Gridiron Pick'em Contest presented by Simple Mobile. It's a completely free-to-play contest that gives you a chance to win big on Sundays. Here's how it works. Simply answer pick'em questions for the week's slate of NFL games and compete for a chance to win your share of $10,000 in cash prizes. If you're one of the highest scoring users on the day, you'll be eligible to win some cold, hard cash. Kickoff will be here before you know it, so head to fanduel.com/free/contest/gridironpick'em and make your picks today. And skip the contracts with high-speed data, talk, and text on a powerful nationwide network with Simple Mobile. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app. Eligibility restrictions apply. It's a 15 transactions day. Let's get to it. Sell Alvin Kamara. So there's a couple of things that have changed in Alvin Kamara's environment recently. The first is that Jameis Winston tore his ACL. He's now done for the year. The Saints used Trevor Siemian this past week, and while the performance could have been worse, Taysom Hill is still sitting there. He's still looming. And Sean Payton was asked about his quarterback situation on Monday, and he was non-committal. It's not a lock that Trevor Siemian is going to be the starter this week. Let's pretend that it's Taysom Hill. As I said on the mailbag show last week, during Hill's 4 starts last season, Kamara watched his target share per game drop to just 13%. It was below 10% in 2 of his 4 games. So far this year, Kamara's target share per game average is over 20%. So it would take a hit with Taysom Hill under center. Not only that, but as I talked about on this show in the offseason, rushing quarterbacks can help running backs be more efficient, but they generally hurt the personnel on their teams. They hurt the skill players. They hurt the running backs, the wide receivers, and the tight ends. And the basic reason as to why this happens is that they just gobble up more work in their offense. Think about it. If the Saints are close to their opponent's end zone, if Taysom Hill is under center, he has a chance to steal that touchdown. That hurts the other players on that team, at least from a fantasy perspective. So if the Saints end up going with Taysom Hill, it's going to hurt Alvin Kamara. So that's one thing to watch. The other issue is that Mark Ingram is now a Saint. The Saints traded for Ingram a couple of weeks ago. He's now played 2 games for them. In those 2 contests, Kamara's running back rush share per game has been about 65%. His target share per game has been 14%. And he had snap shares of 67% and 68% with Mark Ingram in town. Before this Ingram deal, Kamara's running back rush share per game was 83.5%. That's significantly higher than what he's seen over the last couple of weeks. His target share per game average was 22.3%. And his lowest snap share in a single game before Mark Ingram got to New Orleans was 72.6%. It's been lower than that in the 2 games with Ingram. Now, Kamara's coming off a pretty big week 9. He was a rock-solid RB1 in fantasy. Given the circumstances around him, it seems like now's the perfect time to sell. As long as you can sell at a premium. Because his environment has changed. And not for the better. Buy Dallas Goedert. So Philadelphia hasn't really seen a negative game script over the last couple of weeks. 2 weeks ago, they completely destroyed the Lions. Jalen Hurts only had 14 pass attempts. This past week, Hurts had 17 pass attempts. And it was in a game that was fairly close. So Hurts has now averaged 15.5 pass attempts per game over his last 2 contests. That number was 34.6 from weeks 1 through 7. Now, I do think that we should expect the Eagles to keep this ground-heavy approach moving forward, because the results have been pretty good. They're playing better than they had from weeks 1 through 7. But how possible is it to keep this up to this degree? Like, can they really sustain 15 pass attempts per game through the rest of the season? And the answer to that is probably not. I mean, you look at what's happened over the last decade across the NFL, no team has come close to that. So then let's talk about Dallas Goedert. The Eagles have now played 3 games this season without Zach Ertz. Goedert has averaged a target share per game in those contests of 32.5%. That number was 11% with Zach Ertz. And that's a continuation of a trend from last year. Goddard was much more consistent and much more productive when Zach Ertz was out of the lineup. Now, I'm not assuming that Goddard's going to keep up this kind of target share, but he's clearly going to be heavily involved in this offense. And when that offense inevitably becomes a little bit more pass heavy, and when the offense starts to score more touchdowns through the air, that's going to benefit Dallas Goedert. Hold Elijah Mitchell. So a couple of weeks ago on this show, I talked about Elijah Mitchell being a sell candidate. It wasn't that I didn't believe in the talent. You guys know that I like Mitchell as a player, or that he wouldn't be able to provide RB2 production in fantasy football. I thought it would be more low-end RB2 production, but I at least said he was an RB2. It's just that a lot of people were viewing him as a high-end RB2 or even a low-end RB1 at the time. And it was tough for me to back that stance, mostly because he just wasn't seeing passing down work. That limits a running back's upside. Mitchell went weeks 7 and 8 without a target. His teammate JaMychal Hasty had 8 targets during that time. On Sunday, though, things changed. Mitchell had a 12.8% target share. That was easily the highest of his season. And he also ran more routes than Hasty did. He did that for the first time all year long with both of those guys being active. Now, there's a chance, and this really hasn't been reported, but there's a chance that Hasty was banged up in that game. But he was still seeing touches late in the contest. So this seems like it could have been a conscious shift by the 49ers coaching staff, that they wanted Elijah Mitchell to be more involved as a receiver, and that bodes really, really well for his rest of season outlook. So I think now he should be viewed as a mid to high-end RB2. I got new information, so I'm shifting my opinion a little bit. And I wanted to call him out on this show because I've talked about Mitchell a lot over the last few weeks. Add Elijah Moore. So we go from one Elijah rookie to another, in Elijah Moore. If you listen to this show through the offseason, you know that I like Moore a lot as a prospect. In my prospect model, only Jamar Chase and Devontae Smith looked better. Rashad Bateman was right there with Elijah Moore as a 96th percentile wide receiver. And Moore finally had his big breakout performance in week 9. He caught 7 of his 8 targets and he had 84 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's great. Hopefully this is what we're going to see moving forward. But do keep this in mind. Corey Davis was out for a second straight game against the Colts. And Elijah Moore's peripherals still weren't amazing in that contest. He had a 15.4% target share. That's kind of average, nothing special. And he played fewer than 60% of the Jets' snaps. But one thing I will add is that he did see the majority of his snaps from the perimeter. You know, that was a big question mark with Elijah Moore entering the league. Was he just going to be a slot guy or could he play on the outside? And that was especially important because Jamison Crowder is a New York Jet and he's a slot guy. So it was great to see Elijah Moore have a big game while playing on the perimeter. But essentially, you want to add Moore this week because he's talented and there's a chance that he builds off of this performance. Buy Jerry Jeudy. So the Broncos seem to be taking it a little slow with Jerry Jeudy, who's coming off that ankle injury. But it's really hard for me to not get excited about this. He's now played fewer snaps than both Courtland Sutton and Tim Patrick in his 2 games since returning from injury. But Jeudy has 12 targets in those contests. Tim Patrick has 8 and Courtland Sutton has 6. Jeudy had a 32% target share against the Cowboys on Sunday. Courtland Sutton hasn't had that high of a single game target share since week 2. The fact that Jeudy isn't playing a full set of snaps and he's still seeing this kind of target share, that shows you that his ceiling is pretty high. So right now is the time to buy. Hold Melvin Gordon. So a couple of weeks ago, I talked about Javonte Williams being a buy candidate. And there were a few reasons for it. One of them is that he's good. He's been really impressive this year. Another reason is because he had a shot, at least some shot, to take over that backfield as the season went on. And then there was the schedule. The Broncos have a very enticing schedule during the fantasy football playoffs, at least for running backs. Now, to be honest, a lot of that same logic could have applied to Melvin Gordon. The biggest difference is that usually when one back ends up emerging out of a backfield, it's usually not the veteran back. It's usually the rookie, the younger guy, the one who's getting more experience, and then he just takes over. But we know that Melvin Gordon's a solid running back. And Melvin Gordon is sharing a backfield with Javonte Williams, which means he has the same schedule as Javonte Williams in the fantasy playoffs. Gordon has now scored 4 touchdowns over his last 3 games. And I think the immediate thought for fantasy managers is to sell him, is to try to trade him away. But I'm not sure that's the route to go. I've talked about this before on the show, but I think the most likely outcome for this backfield is that it's going to be split through the rest of the season. Now, Williams has more upside to take over the backfield without an injury. That's still part of his allure. But we can't assume that's a lock to happen. And that's especially true because Melvin Gordon's producing. So there is still some intrigue with Melvin Gordon. And when looking at weeks 14 through 17, no team has a more favorable running back schedule than the Denver Broncos when looking at adjusted points allowed to the position. Each of their opponents ranks in the top half of the league in points allowed to running backs. Now, it's tough to actively go out and try to trade for Melvin Gordon. I wouldn't be doing that. But if I had him, I wouldn't be looking to sell just because he's outperforming in the touchdown column. I think there's a legitimate chance that he could be an RB2 during the fantasy playoffs. Buy Jarvis Landry. So before everything went down with Odell Beckham last week, I actually had Jarvis Landry as a buy candidate in the 15 transaction show. And then he went out against Cincinnati and he had 11 total yards. So good job, JJ. But I do think the process still says that Landry's a buy. The Browns played an amazingly good game script against Cincinnati. And it's one that we just can't count on week in and week out. Within the context of the offense, Landry was still heavily involved. He finished the day with a 26.3% target share. That's the third straight game that he's had where he's seen a quarter or more of Cleveland's targets. We know the ceiling is generally capped for a player like Jarvis Landry in a run-heavy offense. I'm not trying to sell Landry as like a wide receiver one or having that kind of upside. But that doesn't make him unusable. I think better days are ahead. Add Donovan Peoples-Jones. So in that same offense, look at Donovan Peoples-Jones off the waiver wire this week. Peoples-Jones hadn't played since week 6 before his week 9 game against the Bengals. But he came back on Sunday. He caught 2 of his 3 targets for 86 yards and a touchdown. He had that big 60-yard touchdown. And the peripheral numbers really don't look that bad. He ran as a starting wide receiver on that team, whether you look at snap share or routes run. And his target share was about 16%. And like I just said with Jarvis Landry, we can't expect the Browns to play in this kind of environment week in and week out. So that type of target share should yield more volume moving forward. I would just grab Donovan Peoples-Jones off the waiver wire just to see if he could develop as like a wide receiver 3 in fantasy football. Sell Damien Harris. Over 38% of Damien Harris's fantasy points have come from touchdowns this year. Among the more than 50 running backs with 40 or more carries this season, that's the 3rd highest rate. James Conner and Latavius Murray are the only 2 who have relied more on touchdowns. If you guys have been listening to this show for a while, you know that Damien Harris is not the kind of running back that I invest in fantasy football. He needs to find the end zone to be usable, to have any sort of ceiling. In his 3 games this year without a rushing touchdown, he's ranked as the RB27, the RB57, and the RB50 in weekly scoring. He's seeing plenty of goal line work, sure. He's going to continue to score some touchdowns. It's not like he's never going to score again. It's just that for him to maintain this RB2 status, he absolutely has to continue scoring touchdowns. Because there's absolutely zero evidence right now that shows us that the Patriots want to utilize him as a pass-catching back. His highest target share in a single game this year came back in week 1. He had a 7.9% share. And something else changed in week 9. New England used Ramondre Stevenson a little bit more on the ground. Both Harris and Stevenson left Sunday's game against the Panthers with 4th quarter injuries. But Stevenson finished with his highest running back rush share since week 5, which was a game where Harris suffered a chest injury. And Stevenson looked good on the ground. He actually had a 60% success rate against the Panthers. Damien Harris's was 27%. That's according to Number Fire's expected points model. I just would rather not have to bank on touchdowns in a very average Patriots offense. And I'd rather not have to worry about how the Patriots coaching staff is going to split that backfield up moving forward. That's why Harris makes sense to trade away right now if you can get a good return. Add Eno Benjamin. It sounds like Chase Edmonds is going to miss multiple weeks because of a high ankle sprain. That's going to allow James Conner to be a potential RB1 in fantasy football. He's going to take on a bigger role. In week 9, he had a 67.7% running back rush share and a 19.2% target share. Those are some awesome numbers. But I still think we're going to see another running back in that backfield get some work, and that's going to be Eno Benjamin. He's the next man up. And he's a player that my prospect model actually liked quite a bit coming out of school. And it's because of his ability to catch passes out of the backfield. He had a best season reception share of over 18% in college. That's one of the parameters that my model looks at. And it's a number hit by just 6% of the running backs in my model's database. I don't think Eno Benjamin is totally unlike Chase Edmonds. So like I wrote in my 15 transactions column, I think we can expect some sort of like diet Chase Edmonds role moving forward. Buy or add Van Jefferson. So Deshaun Jackson's last game for the Rams came in week 7, but even in that game, he only ran 3 routes according to Pro Football Focus. Now, unsurprisingly, that's coincided with Van Jefferson seeing more work in this offense. In weeks 7 and 8, Jefferson had target shares of 17.1% and 17.6%. And in those games, he finished his fantasy football as 22nd and 33rd ranked wide receiver. He ran a similar number of routes as Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods. Now, on Sunday night, LA couldn't do anything offensively against Tennessee. They had a bad game. Sometimes that happens. But Jefferson once again ran a similar number of routes as Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp. They ran 55 and he ran 53. His target share was about 15% and he actually led the team in air yards. He has just 11 fewer air yards than Cooper Kupp over the last 3 weeks, and he's led the LA Rams in end zone targets during this time. Jefferson is going to be more productive than most realize from now through the end of the season. Sell Devontae Freeman. Look, anytime a Ravens running back has a stretch of really good performances, he's a sell. Devontae Freeman has had 3 straight weeks where he's ranked as an RB2 in fantasy football, a top 24 running back. But it's because of touchdowns, like straight up. His running back rush share per game over this stretch is just 41.7%. His target share is a little over 7%. Week 9 was the first time that Devontae Freeman saw double-digit touches in a single game this season. There's nothing unique about Devontae Freeman. Nothing. And Latavius Murray is going to be back eventually too. So I'm using this as a reminder with these types of situations, sell the player. If you have Freeman, throw him in a trade and see if you can upgrade a spot in your lineup. Add Rashad Bateman. Okay, I know I've talked about Bateman so much on this show. I just have to bring him up one more time. This is the last time, I promise. His percent rostered number is still way too low over on Yahoo. That's why I'm bringing him up. He's now played 3 games in the NFL. In those games, he's seen target shares of 22.2%, 14.6%, and 19.5%. That's equated to 6, 6, and 8 targets. Now, Baltimore's been more pass heavy this year than in previous seasons, but they still rank 27th in pass rate. What's really helped their pass catchers is their 70 plays run per game. That's the highest mark in the league. That's where the volume's coming from. They have a slightly different mentality. They are throwing more, probably because they don't have any running backs and the defense isn't playing as well. But the reason that so many of these pass catchers can be relevant in this offense is because they're running so many plays. It's really, really helpful. I don't think we should still see this as this like super, super advantageous situation. It's not like Tampa Bay or anything. And Sammy Watkins could be back soon too. That could hurt Bateman's projected target share. But you can't just wait around and see how things unfold. Talented players who are seeing good work in a high-end offense, they need to be rostered, period. So if Bateman is out there, and this is the last time I'm saying this, if Rashad Bateman is out there, please add him. Add Dan Arnold. So I talked about Dan Arnold back in week 6 on this show. His percent roster number on Yahoo has increased, but not nearly enough. Arnold joined Jacksonville back in week 4. He ended up splitting time with other Jags tight ends in that game against Cincinnati. But since then, he's been the obvious number 1 tight end on that team. He's been the primary pass-catching tight end. From week 5 through week 9, Arnold's run nearly 100 more routes than any other tight end on that team. He's also seen a target share per game average of 20.5%. That's not easy to find at the tight end position. And that's also generated fantasy points. In PPR formats, he's been a top 10 tight end in 3 of his last 4 games. Since DJ Chark's season-ending injury, which coincides with Arnold's arrival in Jacksonville, Arnold has seen 30 targets. That's more than Marvin Jones and Laviska Shenault. And it's only 1 fewer than the team leader, Jamal Agnew, who has 31. Finding volume is difficult at the tight end position. Dan Arnold is getting that volume. You need to add him. Add the Philadelphia Eagles defense. I got to be honest with you guys. Week 10 might be the most difficult streaming week of all time. That's not even hyperbole. There are no good quarterback or defensive options that are rostered in a low number of leagues. So I guess you could go to Philadelphia. The Eagles face the Broncos in a game with a low 44-point over-under. That's according to FanDuel Sportsbook. And Denver's been a pretty advantageous matchup this year for opposing defenses. They rank as the 8th best matchup in adjusted points allowed. So I guess you could do worse. The 16 transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to add Taysom Hill. I know this sounds backwards. I know it seems weird, but here's the deal. Quarterback streaming, like I just alluded to, it's absolute trash this week. Like, I don't think I've ever seen a span of 2 weeks with worse quarterback streaming options. Now, there are some reasons for it, but I don't want to get to that right now. Instead, let's focus on this game theory move. I talked about Taysom Hill last week being a cheat code in fantasy football, and that hasn't changed with Trevor Siemian being the starter in week 9. If Taysom Hill is the starter, he's going to bring that extra element with his legs that's going to give him a nice floor-ceiling combo each week. And here's the deal. I'd be more willing to take a chance on Hill being named starter later this week than I would be on adding a subpar streaming option. Like, I'll be honest with you guys, the top streamer I would have named would have probably been Teddy Bridgewater. His spot this week isn't even that good. It's just that he's a player who's not facing an elite defense. He has good weapons. He probably won't completely sink your team. Teddy's fine. But look across your league and ask yourself how many people need a player like Bridgewater. If the answer is 0 or maybe 1 team, then risk it and pick up Taysom. And hope that he's named the starter. And this is merely speculation and game theory. I wouldn't be shocked at all if Trevor Siemian is named the starter for New Orleans once again. I have no idea at this point. I'm just saying that the opportunity cost in foregoing a player like Teddy Bridgewater, it's not significant. Even if he's one of the top streamers this week. So I figured I'd make this the 16th transaction so you can sort of get a different view of how I handle the waiver wire. It's not always just about the information that we have when we make our moves. It's sometimes about predicting the information that's going to come days later. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow.